And there's Jeff. I haven't seen Jeff in a while. He's back in Florida. Okay. I'll talk to him later.
He and I are doing some things.
Oh, good.
Good morning. Well, thank you for being here bright and early. The database and practice management diehards are us. This is an exciting session that we've put together to go through the value of the database, but also the value of how you use the database in your clinical practice. As you'll see throughout the entire STS annual meeting this year, database topics are permeating it. There's a lot of development going on, and it's thanks to the leadership of Felix Fernandez, who will be your first speaker, as well as Frank Fazzolari, who will be co-moderating. My name is Vinay Badwar from WVU in Morgantown, and it's a delight to see this type of agenda because it is somewhat unique in how we take novel pearls from the database and improve quality, but also efficiency in your practice. And so with that very brief background, you'll see from the speaker list we have kind of the who's who authorities on these topics. But we'll start this out, of course, with Felix Fernandez, who's from Emory University, and the current workforce chair on national databases to kick us off. Felix?
All right, thank you, Vinay.
Thanks, Vinay.
Hi, good morning, everyone. We have all the early risers here this morning. Let's see how I switch this. Do I just click to go forward, or does it need to be loaded? Okay, well, I'm excited to have the opportunity this morning to share with you some of the new features of the STS National Database. What I'd like to do is first give you an introduction to these new functionalities and then show you in some detail how they will enhance your data quality and dashboard reporting, which will make it easier for you to use your data in a meaningful way in your daily practice. So these are the major functionalities that will be introduced. There's a 24/7 cloud-based platform. This will allow for continuous data harvest and data cleaning, which will decrease the amount of time spent on data submission. We've developed interactive dashboard reporting with real-time access to data. As it's entered, it appears on the dashboard. You have the ability to drill down to specific cases and see risk factors or outcomes of interest, and the ability to compare this to your STS benchmark data. Your data managers will have user-friendly data quality reports that come back immediately after data is entered and allow them to drill down to specific data quality issues. And also coming in July at no additional cost is a web-based data entry option. You can stick with your vendor if you like, if that's a benefit to you, or you can use this web-based option. And with this option, data cleanup happens at the time of case entry, which will further reduce burden for our data managers. So the release of these functionalities will occur in a phased fashion. So phase 1 implementation or rollout, which will begin this week for the adult cardiac surgery database, to be followed shortly thereafter by thoracic and then congenital, will include a new data upload function, enhanced data quality and missing variable reports to ensure the accuracy of the data. And on the dashboard reporting, again, the data will be presented as it's entered into the database. Initially, you will see your unadjusted outcomes in comparison to STS benchmark data. With phase 2 rollout or implementation, which will occur in the spring for the adult cardiac database, and then in the summer for both congenital and thoracic, we will establish bidirectional data exchange with DCRI, with the Analytics Center. So what that means to you is this is when you will see your risk adjusted outcomes on the dashboard, essentially at the end of the first harvest period for each database. So let's first take a look at data quality. And this is what your data manager will see. So they'll select a file from their vendor software and upload it. And once the file is validated, two things will happen immediately. A data quality report is generated, and the data is presented on the dashboard. So this is a big change from the typical 3 to 4 day wait the data managers are accustomed to receiving their data quality report at present. And this is what a data quality report will look like that the data managers will see, and errors and warnings will be presented. And in the upper right-hand corner, you can see alerts by patient record. And if you click a specific record, all the alerts or warnings that correspond to that record are displayed. So once these data issues are identified at present, the data manager does need to return to the vendor software and fix this and re-upload the data. With the web-based option, again, that's coming in the summer, you will be able to make these corrections as you go. This is the missing variable report, and really what the missing variable report allows you to do is look across all of your submitted data, not just specific to one data upload. So this is a very good way of validating that the data that the warehouse has is the data that you intended to submit. Here you see a list of variables with percent missing for each variable, and if you click on an individual box as shown here, you see those case records for which there is a missing value for that particular variable, so you can go back and fix it. So then let's take a look at the dashboards. So this is the dashboard that has been developed for the adult cardiac surgery database. Again, once the data is entered, it appears on the dashboard. On the left, you see a menu of reports that correspond to the section headings of the data collection form. Here you see the report for risk factors. So some of the variables are displayed in bar charts in the upper third of the screen. For example, the percentage of patients with diabetes at a site compared to STS averages. In the middle third, there is a table that contains all of the variables for that section of the data collection form. For instance, here you have the distribution of body mass index at a site compared to STS averages, and you can scroll up and down to analyze all the variables that pertain to that section. This is the operative data report, and again, certain variables are displayed at the top in bar chart form, the distribution of elective, urgent, and emergent cases in comparison to the STS averages. And then again, all the variables for that section are presented in a table in the center section of the screen. Here we see an example of the utilization of an internal mammary artery graft for a coronary bypass surgery. And you can see in this site there were 5 instances where that conduit was not used. So if you select that box in the lower third of the screen, those 5 particular cases are displayed so you can investigate those further. And then you see this blue link that corresponds to each case, and if you click that, you then drill down to the individual patient record, and then you can interrogate the individual record for that particular patient. This is a section for postoperative events. Again, you have certain major complications that are displayed on the bar charts in the upper third. Here, the incidence of prolonged ventilation and renal failure displayed against STS averages, and table with all the variables for that section, such as surgical site infection. So because this data is displayed as it's entered into the database, this gives you the ability to get an earlier signal of a potential quality issue you may be having in your practice rather than discovering it when your participant feedback report arrives several months later. You can also select the table in the center and just expand it to show all the data in a tabular view as shown here for postoperative events. And these files are downloadable as Excel files for use in documents or presentations. And the bar charts that I've shown you as well can be downloaded for other uses. And then again, I'll just show you the mortality section. The upper third will show you your 30-day, your discharge, and operative mortality, which again is the discharge combined with 30-day mortality in comparison to your STS averages. And then this data is presented in the table in the middle. And if you wanted to specifically query your patients who died in hospital, as shown in the dark green box there, you select that, and those specific cases will be populated in the lower third of the screen, and you can investigate those further. So we have also developed dashboards for the congenital heart surgery database, just to briefly show you. There again is a menu of reports that correspond to the section headings on the data collection instrument, and additional filters that relate to age group, stat categories, and procedures based on benchmark procedures or all procedures. And we have a dashboard for thoracic as well, with the reports corresponding again to the section headings of the data collection instrument, and additional filters based on procedure type. So as I mentioned, with the phase 2 implementation again in the spring for the adult cardiac surgery database, and in the summer for both congenital and thoracic, you will begin to see your risk-adjusted outcomes. And I'll just be a minute. I'll get this alarm. So this is just an example of that. And this shows data for mortality for coronary bypass surgery. And so you see in the lower left-hand corner, your observed mortality rate is plotted against the STS predicted risk of mortality. In the upper right-hand corner, your observed to expected mortality ratio is plotted, and in the lower right, the risk-adjusted operative mortality is shown over time. So really exciting data that we can present to you on the dashboard. So just to summarize, new features that will be incorporated into the database include a cloud-based platform with 24/7 access, facilitated data submission and cleanup, which will reduce burden and make your data more accurate. The data is immediately available after submission, so you can use it sooner. The dashboards are interactive, allowing you to query specific patients or outcomes of interest. They're compared to STS benchmark data. And in the phase 2 implementation, we will have access to our risk-adjusted outcomes. So really grateful to STS and IQVIA staff who have been working very hard on this over the past year. I do also want to thank David Wormuth, who's the chair of our informatics task force, who has worked with STS a lot on this and really helped me put together a lot of these slides, and really knows this platform in great detail. The STS and IQVIA staff are here to help you during this transition to the new database platform, and their contact information is provided here. Thank you.
Thank you, Felix. Any questions for Dr. Fernandez? Our last speaker can't be with us today, so we have extra time for talks and discussion and questions. So if you have any questions now, we can ask Dr. Fernandez or after the first group of speakers. All right. Our next speaker is Dr. Steve Manookian. He is a former interventional cardiologist and now runs HCA's cardiovascular service line. Good to see you.
Thanks for having me here this morning. It's a privilege to chat. I tend to think the people in the audience actually know the most about the STS database, and the people that aren't in this room are those that we're really trying to reach. So hopefully all of you are the the ambassadors for advocating increased use in STS. I'm interventional cardiologist by training, a former Emory Fellow and a former Emory faculty member as well, Felix. And very simply put, we use it in every way possible. I think the most common thing that we hear when we go anywhere from our facilities in the UK and in the Northeast to Alaska, a surgeon will almost typically say, "My patients are sicker than yours." And I don't think I've ever had a surgeon say, "My patients are not as sick, and really I should have an O to E ratio of like 0.2 or something." But, you know, he was in Alaska and he came out of a glacier, or he's in the stroke belt, or he's in Texas and he's in the country illegally. I mean, there are reasons why patients don't seek health care until the last minute, and sometimes that influences their outcomes. HCA is a large organization. What Frank's asked me to discuss is really how do we utilize this registry in an aggregate format, and really it's a bit of a snapshot of how STS uses it across the U.S., because we represent about 200 hospitals across the U.S., about 90 of which have open heart programs. So we're a large cardiovascular enterprise. If you look at these pillars on the right-hand side, we very simply use STS and national registries in every way possible. Market development is how do we create dashboards and communicate with our facilities and markets to understand their clinical and business performance. How do we understand those that are in leadership roles? Are they achieving their, say, surgical directorship leadership roles? How do we assess whether or not a program should, quote, stay open, close, have advanced services? How do we recruit? In every recruit that we talk to, we ask about their case logs and we ask about their national registry performance. If we talk to a surgeon and they say, "We've never heard of the STS database," that's a very different answer than, "I was integral in making my program 3-star for every year that I've been here." We also navigate patients with diseases of interest. I'm certainly excited about things like the TVT component of the registry, thoracic components of the registry. These are important areas. We have a little bit of a saying around campus, which is, if you didn't have the STS registry, how would you know how well you're doing or how not well you're doing at the same time? It doesn't happen without strong physician leaders, and these are the physician leaders that we count on most, practicing physicians that excel in every category. I see Sinu here in the room, but very simply put, we have 4 or 5 that will be here at this meeting, 4 of whom are surgeons, and help us navigate all portions of what we do in cardiothoracic surgery. So it's a team sport. If you take it beyond that, we have a number of physicians that are attending. We actually want to get to a point where we have as many physicians attending this meeting as possible to learn about new advances in technology and what the registry can do, et cetera, et cetera. It goes to physician engagement. How do we talk at our scientific meetings that are internal about how are we doing in the registry? And we have teams of scores of people at the hospital level, at the market level, and at the corporate campus in Nashville that help us disseminate aggregate reports, disseminate the annual paper that's published on the outcomes, all of the ways that we think we should be driving this home to understand deviations between one physician or another. Oftentimes, as you can imagine, we're called upon to self-assess our own facilities in an internal peer review type of process before it gets to something broader. And we count on registry data, both internal as well as external national registries, to accomplish that. I've always said the same thing, which is there's no reason to create an internal database if we have an external database that can give us better and more rigorous answers through DQRs and other possible scenarios. Obviously, cardiac and thoracic surgery are big parts of our key focus areas, and I think that the perfect example is how little we know about TAVR compared to surgical AVR, how little we know about the practice of thoracic surgery compared to cardiac surgery, and I very much look forward to understanding those outcomes so we can know what good looks like. We have a lot of transcatheter programs, and I'm fortunate enough to serve on the TVT advisory, and many of our physicians serve in leadership roles on the STS database. But very simply put, we need to understand that of the 4,000 TAVRs we'll do in a given year, is that a better approach for our patients than surgical AVR, and in whom? And I think we're still scratching the surface. Certainly in VAD and in mechanical circulatory support and in transplant, these are areas where I very much look to the STS to help us understand. And STS is an organization where we say, call the STS first and don't call anyone else instead unless they don't have the answer for us. And then lastly, internal research helps us understand our own outcomes when we're comparing those. And we, like everyone, is talking about predictive analytics, big data, AI, et cetera, et cetera. So how are we doing with that approach? We're very fortunate that in these light blue bars, our HCA Healthcare is a growing organization with that approach. Again, we believe that good growth on sound clinical performance based in the STS registry is the way to go. I put this out there so that you can help understand the landscape of what we're seeing in terms of procedural volumes. This is what's generally called same store, so it's kind of apples to apples comparison. But if you look about halfway down this grid, you can see what we saw in CABG, but even more importantly, what we saw in surgical valvular disease. So we saw a slight decline in surgical valvular disease, and as you can see directly above that, that's almost completely due to the growth of TAVR and the growth of transmitral. We anticipate that CABG forecasts will be generally flat or population-based, maybe a little bit lower than population-based estimates. And on the valvular side, I'm sure it's to no surprise that TAVR is becoming the dominant strategy for replacing a stenosed valve, and the mitral is soon to follow. We also believe that heart failure, MCS, VAD, those are areas where we need to understand through registries, should this patient get an Impella, should this patient get a VAD or not, and what were their outcomes? Because unfortunately, the only people talking now are industry-sponsored trials, and that leads to some potentials for bias. So John Jennings leads our clinical team. John's been with HCA for a long time, and he is really in charge of our internal tools. We have so many internal tools. This is a website that folks can go to that when you eventually click down to this site, it's the CV Surgery Playbook. It talks about, very simply put, STS 3-star, how to get there. Our aspiration is to have all 90 of our programs be 3-star STS for everything. Everyone in this room knows that's an aspiration that's not achievable. I believe it's 10% of programs are 3-star and 10% of programs are 1-star. And then we start talking about, okay, we want high 2-star programs compared to low 2-star programs because there's an ocean of performance in there. But how do we get there? What are the virtual abilities for us to help? What are the on-site abilities for us to help? Where should Dr. Reddy, Dr. Dewey, Dr. Fontana, et cetera, go in person to spend several days to help understand clinical performance in a program and how best to achieve that? Then we also talk about our STS dashboards. We take many of the reports that you have and aggregate them. We do forced rankings of our facilities. We try to make meaningful comparisons of who's moved in the right direction, who's not. Okay, can we get there? Can we sustain it? Is our clinical performance a surprise? Oh my gosh, I can't wait until the report comes to tell us how we did. Well, you should know that before the report comes. You should have a way to assess data in real-time performance. And we, like others, are talking to Qcentrics and Lumetics and every other company known to man to be able to say, I want to know how this patient's going to do before they go to the OR, not 6 to 12 months later. I'm sure every one of us understands that as an aspiration. So this is, believe it or not, this is our business dashboard. This is the quality page from the business dashboard, and I've taken the liberty of showing off Dr. Reddy, which on the top here talks about the NCDR registries from our colleagues at the American College of Cardiology, and at the bottom here starts to talk about our performance in STS. Where are we 2 stars? Where are we 3 stars? These are HCA ranks, so it tells you about where they are within the scheme of things. And you know, we're very, very proud when these numbers look good, and we're not so proud when they don't. But it at least opens our eyes to say, why is that? Is that, did we just have a lightning storm and we had a couple of tough cases, or is there's something here that's different? This program has infrastructure needs. This program doesn't have the right perfusionists. They have traveling nurses. They have the wrong surgeon leadership. What is it that's telling us, you know, what it is that's going on? Maybe they shouldn't do this type of surgery, they should refer that to their parent facility or their hub if they're a spoke, et cetera. And then we look at it over and over again. And again, we're not proud yet of where we are, and we are firmly committed to public reporting universally for everything. And I'm sure you know that U.S. News and World Report and everyone else looks at that in terms of determining who they think is good. And there's still challenges with the integrity of data and the integrity of the people that are putting in the data and loopholes and things. But we are very committed to us understanding where we are in terms of where our goals are in meaningful metrics. And at every step of the way, surgeons and other clinical providers should be at the forefront of that. The data needs to stay as close to the providers as possible, and they need to be understanding where we are in terms of our performance. And again, as I mentioned, it's really about driving real-time performance at scale. Again, it's so hard to influence what your physician colleague is doing, let alone another hospital that's 10 miles away, let alone in an organization that ranges, honestly, from London, England, all the way to Alaska. But we're trying to do our best to be able to execute to make sure we achieve our goals. We have some milestones. We like to talk about them, but really our first and foremost aspiration is to have 0 one-star programs in any category, and then all of our programs be 3-star, and we're not going to quit until we get there. And that's thanks to our great surgeons in this room. I see Russ Stahl is here as well, and those countless others that do great work every day. So thanks very much.
Any questions for Dr. Manoukian? I want to get the discussion going and maybe dovetail into the next talk. What is HCA, if anything, what do they do with underperforming sites, underperforming programs?
Right, so we tend... We tend to be to want to coach people up. I don't think these are on, but
that's on.
We tend to want to coach people up, right? I mean, that's what we should do. We should try to understand when there's challenges in performance, what the root causes for that are. And so I think there's more of a multi-step process to understand, is this data accurate and what were the root causes? You know, we're a receiving hospital for out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, and we only get the worst patients. They only call us on Christmas Eve when the patient's, already on every means of support. And they're 500 miles away, and there's about 17 programs between us and them. I wonder why they're calling us. And if you have those buckets of programs, then you have to understand what the clinical performance is. But I would say, to answer your question succinctly, if we can't coach up programs and we change leadership and can't get the outcomes that we'd like, again, it's an eyes wide open decision to say, do we believe we can offer this service here or not? And in some cases, we've looked at the redundancy in our programs, and volumes are a challenge. The bad clinical outcomes, there's only one thing worse than bad clinical outcomes in a low volume program, and that's bad clinical outcomes in a high volume program. And so if you're in that situation and you have the luxury to say, we've got 6 programs in Dallas, then maybe we need to make a change.
Any other questions or comments? You're going to have a chance to talk and discuss with the speakers at the end of the first part of the session. Our next talk is past STS President, Dr. Richard Prager, and I asked him to come and give us his insights and lessons learned in his odyssey in starting a statewide quality collaborative. Everybody's aware of the Michigan Quality Collaborative. It's a benchmark for statewide collaboratives using SDS data. And really, it's a testament to Rich's ability to herd cats, to get surgeons from 33 heart programs across a big state with 2 separate peninsulas and get them to come together and discuss and help improve quality. I think is a Herculean task, and I can't think of anybody else who could have done it other than Dr. Prager. So, Dr. Prager.
Frank, Felix, thank you both very much for the opportunity. That was unnecessarily kind. I wish I had some of the control Dr. Manoogian has, because I think you can raise the level with different techniques than just embarrassment, which is what we often use. So let me take you on a quick journey over the next 10 minutes about what we've learned from starting a statewide quality collaborative, the wins, losses, and the surprises, and perhaps some of the techniques. So our state collaborative is actually embedded in a professional society, the Michigan Society of Thoracic and Cardiovascular Surgeons. First president, Cameron Haight, happened to be from the University of Michigan. And we felt as we were starting this journey that part of the aspects of a professional society are actually to monitor your own quality. So this is not a separate organization. It is part of our professional society in the state of Michigan. We were prompted and learned a great deal from Jerry O'Connor and Bill Nugent and the NNE and their 1991 article talking about a regional prospective study of in-hospital mortality, and basically realizing what they concluded, that the in-hospital mortality rates from their 7 institutions in the NNE were not the results of differences in case mix. Everybody did the sick patients, but were variables in the institutions that were unknown aspects of patient care. So you could switch the patients, but some patients did better at certain institutions. So with that, we said, why don't we look at our own data? And this is early on, and we had enough then mid-career to senior surgeons who thought this was a good idea, who were submitting their data to the SDS voluntarily, and we basically had to call the SDS and ask, can you put together a report? Can we look at all our sites? It'll be blinded. You can't read part of this slide. Neither could we in the book. And thankfully, we're going to IQVIA, so someone will look at results rather than turn a big PDF, which has always been a little bit of a challenge for all of us at our institutions. So we got these types of report. We paid with dollars from an AHRQ grant that was shared with us. And over 3 or 4 years, we had every program in the state participating voluntarily, just because, really, they didn't want to not be invited to the party. That's what happened. And then we were fortunate enough that Blue Cross Blue Shield had started a quality initiative in another domain, and that was interventional cardiology and cath. And they were looking at renal failure, blood transfusions in that. So they came to talk to the cardiac and thoracic surgeons 3 times. We would like to fund it. We would like to fund it. And we objected to it for 3 years, saying, you'll want our data. You'll measure us in a way we don't like. And besides that, you don't pay us enough. So why should we play with you? That all changed. Eventually, we were funded. And frankly, we need the funding to set up the infrastructure to do what we do. The next major change was a few years after everyone in the state, all 33 programs, were paying voluntarily. We decided it was too clumsy to actually show the data encrypted at our meetings. And our meetings are confidential meetings. It would be a room just like this, and everyone signs a confidentiality agreement. But we would spend time trying to translate the slides into who is this hospital, who is this hospital. And we just said we could move this faster and have better, richer discussions if we unblinded data. So now 33 sites, name of the hospital, is on every single slide. And basically, it's a very simple process. We have the analytics. Most of it is STS data based, but we have some of our own data in our own warehouse. We provide feedback at the quarterly meetings, and we talk about what should the goals be. How do we start that conversation? We look at Dr. X and say, how did you do so well in this quarter? Or over the last year, you used to have 60% prolonged ventilation. What did you change? Will you share this with us? And then we'll talk about a low-performing hospital, and I'll tell you a little bit in a few minutes of how we challenge the low-performing hospitals to participate in the conversation, because there are low-performing hospitals, and it could be you one time, one quarter, it could be the person sitting next to you. So the purpose of this collaborative was really to improve quality at every site. This was not punitive. It was really, can we all get better? We turned the STS data and some other data points into information and then created, if you will, action. And we did it in a community of learners so that everyone wished to come to these meetings, because most of the surgeons, quite frankly, didn't know their data until we showed it. And we're not using AI yet. It will come, but it will come from bigger places than a state collaborative and funded by other sources. So this is just fundamental, simple lessons in listening, understanding, and coming up with plans. This is who we are. We actually now have all 33 centers, 150,000 records. We have a perfusion registry that is essentially universal in the state. We have 51% of the general thoracic surgical centers participating voluntarily, and we have all 27, by the way, 27 out of 33 cardiac surgical programs in Michigan do TAVR. And we have all the 27 sites data, and we also have 3 congenital surgery centers, and they're kicking off this summer at our state meeting their own collaborative, which will eventually morph into a higher level collaborative around the country, is the hope and the plan, but we'll start the platform. There are other collaboratives around the country. Many of you know them. They're listed here. I won't go through them. And there are different models. We may not be the perfect model. We happen to be funded, which is advantageous. We can audit our own sites. We do. And we have the opportunity to have meetings and bring guests to speak intermittently as well. But you can see there are multiple other collaboratives, and they all have a little different model. We are not necessarily the model or the perfect model. But we certainly do it this way. There is no blame. There is sharing to create ways to do everything we do in a better way. I'll give you just a couple of examples and then tell you about the surprises and challenges. And you may know about this. This actually really showed us what we could learn. We realized looking at the early data, we had 7 sites that weren't using the mammary. Now this is unheard of today, and frankly it was unheard of then. So we educated the sites, we talked to them, and we had everybody fill out a form. If you don't use it, why didn't you use it? Very simple technique. All of a sudden, everybody started using it, and that's where we were in a few years. And we've continued that way. And tomorrow we'll talk about multiple arterial grafting, and we're using the same simple hammer to create a better opportunity to consider multiple arterial grafting now in this era. What else did we do? Frank Shannon from the Beaumont system utilized what the NNE was using and what Fred Grover and the VA system. And basically, this was just a form, so you learned how to talk about bad outcomes, just like we all did in training. But we save and we look at every death in the state of Michigan with a phase of care, and we broke it down into preoperative, intraoperative, ICU, floor, discharge, trying to understand why people died, which is actually a fascinating undertaking, and it's about 3% of the 11,000 to 12,000 cases we do a year, and it includes TAVR. Was it because of pre-op decision making or a decision about timing? Should the patient have been operated on? Was there a different operation? Did you not understand all the variables? Did you not really have a good echo? So when you walked in the room, you weren't surprised with what the echo intraoperatively showed. And we categorize these preoperative, intraop. It's not so much there are technical errors because we look at all these deaths and catalog them. Or ICU, failure to recognize and rescue, or failure to recover the floor or discharge. What do we know now? And we've compared 2 periods of time. Avoidable mortality has decreased. That's obviously good. But the discharge phase is the only phase of care in which no significant improvement, because we really can't figure out why some of the people die after they go home. We all understand that. And that the highest proportion of seminal events and the highest number of seminal events deemed avoidable continue to occur in the preoperative phase. We need to talk more about timing, what the operation can be tailored to the patient and things like this. And this is what we've realized over the years. The same with failure to rescue. Are we structured well enough to care for patients after we do a complicated operation? Do we recognize triggers for things that will occur? And we looked at this and basically said complications occur across the state at about the same %, but there are hospitals that recognize them much more quickly and can come up with things that save patients' lives. And so we look at ICUs around the state. What were the early wins? You need senior surgeon leader engagement. We had it initially. Surgeon behavior can be changed. Hard for this group to believe, but surgeon behavior can be changed. The sociology of group learning. For all the PhDs in the audience, and I've said this before, I apologize, you don't have to have a PhD to do this. You need to engage people. Humble inquiry, how do we ask the questions? How do we talk about death? How do we talk about failure to rescue? And we are not timid about embarrassing people to say, did you know that these were your results? No, this is the first time I saw them this quarter. We don't quite have the hammer that HCA may have, but even the first time, can you tell us why you think this has occurred? And we have invited hospital administrators to our meetings. And we have created a culture, which actually is a big part of the platform and the foundation to how to be successful. What are the surprises? Everyone wanted to play within 3 years, because if they weren't, someone might talk about them. Unblinding data was a natural step and actually became easy for us. And some surgeons do wait until the meeting to see their data, because then it actually will be flushed out and discussed in an expanded fashion. And participants enjoy the meetings and actually become uncomfortable not coming, because we have no problems talking about you if you're not there. That's kind of, that's basically in the sheet you sign. We're happy to talk about you whether you're here or not at the meeting. But where are we today? And I'll conclude with this. Institutional priorities sometimes compete with the collaborative priorities. And we all understand that. We're complex institutions. There are a lot of challenges for our institutions. There is measurement fatigue. We wear ourselves out sometimes. There are pressures at our institutions. We'd like to be a high reliability collaborative, but let me tell you, you all know that your hospitals want to be high reliability. And we get pulled into meetings and things like this that sometimes kind of just spread us too thin. And another challenge is the senior surgeons keep coming to the meetings. Sounds good, except the younger surgeons aren't always available to come. They're taking call. They need to continue this movement. So you need to share this at your institutions. But we understand this. These are acceptable, appropriate challenges, and we believe they can be overcome. What have we learned? You need dedicated surgeons. You have to play. And you have to drive quality at your own institution. Benchmarking helps in reviewing and validating what we're doing, and you need to be comfortable with it. Creating a learning health system culture provides a safe space to create improvement, but to honestly discuss your failures and why you were able to improve in the areas you were. And we cannot hide from our outcomes, and we know that. And it's very important that we become the spokespersons just for that approach. And one size for improvement and one size for how to discuss data doesn't fit all. We keep changing at our meetings on how to present and how to do certain things. And we want to shape the behaviors at the sharp end so that outcomes become better and better. And I'll conclude with this quote from Donald Berwick, who sometimes we agree with, sometimes we don't, but I think this is what evolved. In the pursuit of improvement, capturing local individual stories and within organization trends is as important for learning as is calculating p-values for relative differences between groups. Small steps. Thank you very much, and I appreciate the opportunity.
Any questions for Dr. Prager? We'll keep moving along. Our next speaker also needs no introduction, is one of the giants in our society. Dr. Sheehan, as you all know, essentially invented the STAR reporting system, and now is leading our society through to public reporting. He's going to discuss that now. Thanks, David.
Well, thanks so much, Frank. I was assigned the title, How Public Reporting is Evolving. And really, I think a more appropriate title would be How Our Perspectives on Public Reporting Might Evolve. This is a very emotional topic. And sometimes it's good to step back a little bit and think systematically about why we do public reporting, what's in it for all the various stakeholders that are involved, and what are some of the potential hazards of public reporting. So first of all, why do we do this? And there's two important facts. First of all, outcomes vary substantially, both at the hospital and the surgeon level. There's no question about this, and it has continued to be an issue. In the best of all possible worlds, we would all be doing fantastic work with very little variation. That still, unfortunately, is not the case. Second fact is that we have the best data and analytics, and if anybody is going to do this, it needs to be us. We believe it's an ethical responsibility to enable patients to have autonomy and truly informed decision-making. We believe it's part of our social contract, and I'm going to unpack some of these concepts a little bit in a second and tell you what I mean by social contract. Public reporting is both an intrinsic and an extrinsic motivator of improvement and is associated with better outcomes. I can't ascribe a particular causation to that. It's just a simple fact. Voluntary public reporting may preempt payer or regulator-imposed initiatives. It may give us leverage to get needed programmatic resources. I think the HCA example would be a perfect example of this. Hospitals having problems, they need more resources, a dedicated ICU. In a public reporting environment, you have some extra leverage to get this. And importantly for providers, it's a gold standard defense against inaccurate commercial report cards. Why shouldn't we do public reporting? And there are some compelling arguments that people have made. Risk aversion, which is denial of care to needy, high-risk patients, and also a negative impact potentially on innovation and training. And then there's the misuse of STS data in advertising or commercial publications with direct provider-to-provider comparisons, and in some cases inappropriate secondary use or re-engineering of publicly reported STS data for other purposes for which it may not be appropriate. So let's unpack some of these concepts. First of all, if you go to our website right now, you will see, as we've had here for years, the STS believes the public has a right to know the quality of surgical outcomes. That's fundamental. One of the ethical responsibilities of any professional in healthcare is to provide patients with the information they need to make an informed choice. We believe that as a society, and I think that's one of the major rationales for public reporting. For those of you that follow the professionalism literature, Richard and Sylvia Cruis are at McGill University, and they have written extensively on this topic of medicine's social contract, both with the public and with the government. We expect, as physicians and members of a professional society, to have autonomy and self-regulation. Those are perhaps at the top of the things that professionals want from society. But what does society and government want from us? Well, they want competency, they want accountability, and by public reporting, I think we assure that we provide them with these. Public reporting, how does it result in better outcomes? Well, there's two pathways. Rich Prager mentioned Don Berwick, who's one of the great leaders in health policy, quality improvement. This is a classic paper that he wrote close to 2 decades ago now, in which he talked about two pathways for using data to drive improvement. And I want to specifically focus on the little motivation pathway at the bottom, where pathway 1, which is selection by patients of providers, has an impact on pathway 2, which is the provider's desire to have better outcomes so that they will attract those informed consumers. So that's the extrinsic pathway by which public reporting drives improvements in quality. But there's also new and I think fascinating data on intrinsic performance motivators. Why do professionals like heart surgeons who are doing very complex tasks, what motivates them? Well, certainly I'm not saying that we're not motivated by having a good salary. Of course we are. But professionals doing complex tasks are much more motivated by things like autonomy, purpose, and mastery. And those of you, I hope, have Many of you have read Daniel Pink's book, Drive, which is absolutely fascinating. So autonomy is the ability to control our own destinies. Purpose is the feeling that you're doing important, meaningful work. And mastery is that desire that everybody in this room has to be a high achiever, to be constantly improving, and to be recognized as experts. And I think that by public reporting, we have the ability to show that level, that high level of competence. So both those extrinsic and intrinsic motivators are associated in public reporting with better outcomes. I'll just show you two examples using STS data. These are data that were reported at the AATS meeting several years ago, published in JTCVS last year on outcomes in Massachusetts, where we've had public reporting for several decades now, and looking at what's happened in our observed operative mortality, expected, and our ODE ratios over that time period compared with STS national data. And as you can see in the top left, once we started public reporting, our observed operative mortalities went way down. Now, we did have a slight dip in expected mortality in the upper right-hand corner, but we started off higher than the STS national. And after a few years of experience with public reporting, our expected values are now pretty much in line with STS national values, and our ODE ratios are consistently below STS national numbers. Compared to national data, there's about a 20% lower odds of 30-day and operative mortality in Massachusetts. If you look at STS publicly reporting sites versus non-reporting sites, it's a similar picture. A highly statistically significantly lower risk-adjusted mortality rate in those STS sites that are publicly reporting. And if you look, and this is just from 2010 to 2014, the first 4 years of the program, every single reporting period, we had significantly significantly higher composite scores at publicly reporting sites. So again, I can't tell you the mechanism for this association, but clearly, if you have two groups of hospitals or surgeons, one of which is publicly reporting and one of which is not, on average, you're going to have much better results at the public reporting site. A gold standard protection for providers. This is something I think we sometimes don't fully acknowledge the value of this. But let me just remind you how many ways people can access data about your hospital or you. The longest experience obviously been in New York State, starting in 1989, and still going strong with reports both at the hospital and at the surgeon level. We started, again, close to 2 decades ago in Massachusetts. Here's a 3-year report from 2003 to 2005. I'm about halfway down the page here. You can see our risk-adjusted mortality rates for all the surgeons in the state. Here is the PHC4 report, both surgeon and hospital from Pennsylvania. Here's the California report. And then you start getting into some of the ones that we worry about a little bit. Here, for example, you have vitals, rate MDs, health grades, consumer checkbook, surgeon ratings. Some of these just talk about patient experience or your background or things like that. But I do want to show you that some of them get very detailed and are based on claims data, and they have risk-adjusted mortality rates and how you're doing, and composite outcomes like risk-adjusted mortality, length of stay, and so forth. This is, I just pulled up some general surgery results from the area around Mass General, but these are highly detailed reports that are available, and I would suspect that 90% of the people in this room, if you go to surgeonratings.org, you'll find some star ratings for yourself. And here's one of the worst. This is the ProPublica surgeon report card, which had so many methodologic errors. I was fortunate to be able to participate in a RAND group, which did a methodologic critique of this report card. They missed 82% of cases, 84% of postoperative complications were excluded, and so forth. So if you have all these other sources out there, having a gold standard source like the STS public reporting, I think is to the advantage of all providers. So let me just talk now about risk aversion. This is a hotly debated topic. I've had the opportunity to do quite a bit of sifting through the literature of this, and if you go to PubMed and look up risk aversion, you're not going to find very much. It's buried in other studies. But the concern here is that in a public reporting environment, there will be a negative impact on access to care for high-risk patients, on training and innovation. So what do the data actually show? Well, in interventional cardiology, there is both anecdotal evidence, survey evidence, and population-level evidence of risk aversion. It's primarily in those high-risk post-MI, PCI patients come in with cardiogenic shock, uncertain neurologic status after a cardiac arrest in the field. And there's no question that in public reporting states, the percentage of those patients that actually get interventions is lower. Also, no question that after identification as a PCI outlier, providers are more reluctant to take on high-risk patients. So in PCI, I think there's good data. Cardiac surgery, there is anecdotal evidence from surgeon and cardiologist surveys. I have found no credible population-level evidence that high-risk patients are being denied care, at least in a meaningful way. There's also two very important points, and I'll show you some of the studies in a second. Very good evidence in cardiac surgery that providers caring for the highest risk patients have the lowest risk-adjusted mortality. Now, why is that? Well, it could be because they're the ones that are taking on, the best programs are taking on these patients, or it could be the fact that our risk models are not only adequate, but probably over-predict risk a little bit at the high end, which is in fact the case. There's also very strong and consistent evidence that in a public reporting environment, there is better matching of high-risk patients and more capable surgeons in hospitals. So just to flesh those out a little bit, here are data. The first two quotes are from Hannon and from Mark Chasson. Mark Chasson was in New York and was very much involved in the origins of the public reporting system in New York. But in both cases, they point out that there's a negative relationship between a hospital's expected and risk-adjusted mortality. So the higher your expected risk-adjusted mortality, the lower your actual mortality. Mark Chasson has pointed out that the hospitals with patients at the highest risk has some of the lowest risk-adjusted mortality. And then Brian Eglum did a national study that I was a participant in, which showed that hospitals that operated on the highest risk patients had risk-adjusted outcomes that were equal or better than those of those treating low-risk patients. And there's no evidence to support the theory that high-risk cases, avoiding high-risk cases, is an effective way to improve your ratings. And then this better matching has been shown by Pat Romano in California, who demonstrated that high mortality hospitals identified as low-quality outliers do tend to operate on less sick patients, but that risk sorting may be desirable if it then leads to higher performing hospitals taking care of those high severity patients. Dr. Glantz in New York showed that for every 10 percentage point increase in patient risk of death, there was a 0.034 reduction in the ODE ratio of the surgeon. So high-risk patients were going to low mortality surgeons. And finally, in a classic paper that's in the health policy and economics literature, they point out that the best providers actually have less incentive to shun sick patients, and then in a public reporting environment, an increased proportion of severely ill patients get treatment at high-quality hospitals. This paper is often used as evidence of risk aversion. It's a Burak paper from New York. But in fact, the important table in this paper is often neglected, and that just shows that the people that are avoiding high-risk patients are actually those surgeons that have been in practice fewer years, that are doing less than 50% adult cardiac surgery and doing few major cases. So it's the less experienced surgeons in general that are turning down patients. So what's the bottom line? We have the best data, the best risk models, the best performance measures. Public reporting with these excellent data and analytics is valuable for all stakeholders: patients, providers, policymakers, and regulators. There's no empirical basis for the belief that avoiding high-risk cases will improve your publicly reported outcomes unless you are a true low-performing provider, in which case you probably should be avoiding those patients. And in a public reporting environment, high-risk patients may be avoided by the less capable providers, but they are accepted by more experienced providers, and those more experienced providers that are taking on those high-risk patients consistently have the best risk-adjusted results despite their case mix. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Any questions for Dr. Sheen? Any questions for the group and as a whole? Go ahead. Is that on?
Nope. I can move over if you'd like. Dan Raymond from Cleveland. I really enjoyed your talk and appreciate all your contributions to this. There's a third pathway. How do you improve your outcomes is one thing that we don't like to talk about, but exists, is gamesmanship. And, you know, a comment was made in a meeting yesterday. This is could be the new tricuspid valve of thoracic surgery, when we were talking about how programs get around registering their higher risk patients if they want to. They do something that moves them out of qualification in a group. And to me, that's my concern, is when you go to public reporting, you're taking a quality database, which is meant for quality improvement, and turning it into a measurement tool. You create motivation for programs to be dishonest, because there's a lot of money involved in saying I'm a 3-star this, I'm a 3-star that. So that to me is kind of one thing you didn't mention in your talk, and I think it should be mentioned, and it should be a topic that how do we figure out how this is being done, and how do we prevent that from happening? The other concern I have with public reporting is, and you mentioned it briefly in the marketing section, is that people use it as a marketing tool. One of the problems, though, is that you'll have people walking around saying, again, 3-star written across their chest, but there's no way to verify that they are being truthful. And if you're on a public stage saying you're a 3-star program, why aren't you voluntarily reporting that out? And a lot of people don't. And it's almost like they're cherry picking. We get a 3-star. Okay, now we're going to go write a paper about how we became a 3-star, went back to 2-star, no one knows about it because we're not publicly reporting. Curious in your comments on that.
Sure. Let's see. Is this on? You hear me? Okay. A couple of points. First of all, gaming in public reporting has been talked about for at least 30 years and was commented on in the early New York experience. I am sure that today there is some gaming going on, but I think to some extent, we have to rely on the professionalism of our colleagues. And I think there is a certain amount of peer pressure among all surgeons and programs that does tend to keep this down. And then we have our audit system, which is pretty unique. There's no other specialty that devotes hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to audit 10% of its records. That's pretty remarkable. So again, professionalism and audit, but there are still things that somebody can do to take you out of an isolated cabbage category. Say that somebody has mitral regurgitation and put a couple stitches in the annulus and of a patient that you don't expect is going to do well. We can't eliminate all the potential for this, but it is still a potential. And in terms of programs that may be a 3-star program transiently and advertise that, and then go to 2-star. Again, there's only a certain amount that we can do as a society. We do have ethical standards for what you can say about your program. And I think in harvest period X, you can say that you are a 3-star program, which is the highest STS rating. But if a program goes beyond that and overstates their results, then we want to know about it at STS. So I'll stop there. I think the comments are all accurate, but I hope, I sincerely hope that the amount of gaming going on and the negative impact of that gaming is far less than the positive impact of what we achieve through public reporting.
Rich, you have any comments about our experience in Michigan with respect to that and programs advertising?
We basically have two experiences. One, we on our website have all the sites reporting, and basically all the sites have decided to report, and we made a comment, or we talked about the easiest way to get to be a 2-star hospital is to publicly report that you're a 1-star hospital, because it changes the whole philosophy in your hospital, frankly. And maybe that's a positive part of gaming, as long as you're not sending sick people away, unless you're sending them to hospitals that are comfortable. But we have had, because of the, if you will, the collaborative, we have had hospitals where the hospital put something on their website that the surgeons didn't know about,
Yeah.
advertising their hospital. And once the surgeon found out, it was automatically pulled right off. So the other thing is to integrate the thinking of the institution into what the purpose of the reporting really is.
Steve, any experience with this nationwide in
Yeah,
HCA?
I mean, I think the benefits of public reporting outweigh any potential downside. That said, I think there have been well-described examples, especially in the interventional cardiology literature, of one simple checkbox of saying this patient has an acute coronary syndrome pretty much gives you carte blanche to do whatever you want in the cath lab. Whereas there's appropriateness criteria that are extraordinarily rigorous for those that are elective, and I'm sure it's identical with everything we're talking about here. I think that said, I think public reporting, we're at an early stage in the continuum. Public reporting means that outside the OR by the sinks, the report's on the wall. And that when the nurses are scrubbing in, they're looking and they're saying, you know, Manukian's not quite a good surgeon as we thought he was. It's individual physician scorecards that have some teeth that maybe go into 20, 40, or 6% of your compensation based upon your outcomes. And so how do you get to that point where patients can make informed decisions? You know, the commercial payers can have gold, silver, and bronze providers, have soft and hard steerage. I really do think that the more integrated the system, the better able the providers will be to be able to accomplish that. What do I mean? That if you have a network of 6 open heart programs in one geographic area, then if that facility says we don't do this type of operation, our goal is to keep that patient stable and get them to the mothership or get them to the hub, then that's a little less painful than a one hospital system who says, you're really going to send that patient from Emory to Piedmont? I mean, come on. You know, is whomever's still left over there, are they really that good? And again, the biggest thing I worry about is just undertreatment. I really do think there is a potential for undertreatment of patients who should have good clinical opinions by all of you. Care of the patient is always more important than the registry performance, and will, unless I'm not in my role, will always say that. But that's what I would say.
One quick technical follow-up. When you audit a program, are you auditing only the cases that are entered in the SDS database, or are you auditing every case that program does?
Well, we audit every case that's in the database, but we also check the cases that are audited, that are entered in the database against the hospital administrative logs. So if there are cases that are not being entered, we identify it. And matter of fact, see Jeff Jacobs here, but I think there was a situation in one of our subspecialty databases a number of years ago where there were some cases that we identified as not having been entered. So that can happen, but the audit process does look at that.
Yes.
Yeah. Good morning. Hi, my name is Brittany Zurschenberg, and I'm an adult cardiac surgeon at Duke, and I'm actually on the STS A&P committee at the DCRI. So, Dr. Shaheen, you mentioned that we have the best performance measurements. We know that one of our edges over interventional methods is long-term survival. So, what are the efforts by the STS to assess long-term outcomes?
Well, I'm delighted. I didn't plant you.
Yeah, who
I'm-
put you up to this?
Yeah, but I'm delighted you brought that up because it is very important. We know that, we started off with in-hospital mortality, and that clearly was inadequate. Then we've gone to 30-day. Then we went to 30-day plus in-hospital. But we know that we should be following patients much, much longer to really see the true impact of what we've done. That's true in adult cardiac surgery, but it's probably even more true in congenital heart surgery and in cancer surgery. So we have now executed a contract with a university vendor, and we'll have the ability to link every record since 2008, every record in the database with National Death Index data, so that we will actually have the ability. Now, National Death Index has one disadvantage, is it takes a year or two to actually get the results back, but we will have the ability to have the best single source of data for long-term survival. So that, plus efforts that are ongoing to give us more facile access to Medicare data. 20th Century Cures Act did, we think, state that we were to be given much easier access than we currently have. And what we'd like to have is continuous, ongoing access to Medicare data. And that, of course, would also give us survival, plus readmissions, reinterventions, all that sort of thing. So the NDI link plus facilitated access to Medicare data, I think will really expand this very important area that you brought up, and thank you for mentioning that.
Thank you.
One question for the panel. So if you look at Dr. Prager's work and the Michigan work, especially about phase of care, and you start breaking it down to phase of care, the subgroup that die from, quote, technical errors, what's the role of the surgeon, I guess, is a big question in these quality outcomes. The numbers that were dying from technical excess mortality that was unpredicted, and the surgeon's role in the technical group and the intra-op group was very small. Most of the deaths occurred in the post-op period, for example, failure to rescue, which has been discussed. And yet we are putting out quality measures of individuals versus hospitals or systems. And my big concern with public reporting is how will we look, when we do our analysis, we see a lot of causes of death, yet we're putting a lot of these causes of death onto individual surgeons. Secondly, the comment about higher risk surgeons that take on higher risk cases have better outcomes. In the measure of quality, there's three things: structure, process, and outcomes. And we've focused a lot on process and outcomes, but society's put nothing on structure. And a lot of the surgeons taking on higher cases have better structures. And so are we doing some people in our group disservices when they have poor structures and we're marking them as poor outcome surgeons, when we all realize how important structure is in outcome and we're not putting that into our database? Thanks.
So if I can paraphrase, the saying that cardiac surgery is a team sport holds true, and we all know that, but I guess your question is, how does that relate to specifically identifying an individual surgeon with the outcome of the team? And to take it one step further, as the changes that are continuing to occur in the organization and delivery of healthcare, where we as practicing surgeons may or may not be losing more and more authority in our institutions and our hospitals, how does that impact the outcomes being identified with each individual particular surgeon?
I'll start from the fundamental level of how we have used the data for our 33 hospitals. And how we use the data for the 33 hospitals is when we use, for example, the POCMA form, if it looks like in the ICU that you don't, you're in charge, you operate on the patient, but the facility doesn't have the coverage or the experience or the nurses, the point of what we do at our level is to point that out and then offer the surgeon the opportunity to talk to an institution, or that we, representatives, come and talk to the institution. So I think you can use the data for that. At the higher level, when we get to the philosophical level of what to do, that's where we need everyone's input on that. But the data can point those out. And then it is our, as the surgeon, responsibility to talk about where the challenges are. It wasn't technical, and sometimes it is, but it wasn't technical, but it wasn't recognized. Or, a deep discussion internally with yourself of, should I have done this patient here? So it's those types of things that at least the early look at the data can show.
So what I think Rich is pointing out is the value of, for something like the Michigan Collaborative, in interacting with an individual surgeon's hospital and administration. The surgeon, as part of the collaborative, may not feel entirely alone. He may feel like he has some help in working some of these issues out. And there are it's an external body that may interact with that hospital and hospital administrator to give another level of authority to and kind of back up what the surgeon may be saying. And I think it might be useful to talk about site visits and what we do, or what you do in Michigan with underperforming hospitals. Maybe explain those to.
We have, just as NNE did, we stole it, but we have site visits, and they're meant to be supportive. And then there is a review after the site visit of, these are the things we do at our hospitals. You might consider doing this at your hospital to improve whatever it is, blood transfusions, mortality, prolonged ventilation. So it's meant to be a facilitator for looking at the mirror in your own hospital.
And I would just second what Rich and Frank have said. You can use the public reporting environment to get the kinds of structural resources that you need to get better results. And I think philosophically there comes a point that if you are at a hospital that won't give you the resources that you need to get good results, how can you ethically bring your patients there? I'd say look for another job, quite honestly. I've been criticized for saying that, but I believe that. If your hospital won't give you what you need to deliver the highest quality care to your patients, find another hospital. I would also, just to second what you said about the importance of the team environment, I think one of the most important papers I've seen in the last couple of years about this is Laurie Schroyer's paper, pointing out that surgeons who operate at multiple hospitals with multiple teams have worse results than surgeons who operate at a single institution. And if you do operate at multiple institutions, you have your best results at your primary institution compared to secondary institutions. So I couldn't agree more about the importance of the team.
Thanks, David. Steve?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're at a tipping point right now. I think we're starting to see programs with stability or maybe perhaps slight declines in rates of CABG and plummeting volumes in surgical valve replacement. I think there are programs now from the administrative perspective that are questioning their need to continue to have a program. But what that creates right now, I think, is too many programs for the United States, and too many of them with low volume programs. And in our neck of the woods, low volume programs means one surgeon, 50 cases a year, locums providers. So 50 cases a year is one a week, right? So on Tuesday, wow, we've got a CABG. We didn't plan to have a CABG on Tuesday. We have no nursing personnel take care of a CABG on Tuesday. And so, you know, we happen to have a traveler and he or she hasn't taken care of a heart in like 90 days. And all of a sudden, you know, it could be a problem case, even, my gosh, for a 55-year-old who needs like a Lima to the LAD. And so I think what my opinion is that clinical performance in cardiothoracic surgery has to be assessed at the building level. Whatever you think your program is, we have the most complex demographic of staff. There's 4 different guys on this stage. We're in 4 different practices. We don't even sit in the same room together. So, but we will be in that aggregate. And then it has to get drilled into, are we as good as each other, and what are the root causes? I'm a little gun shy. You'll take everybody. You've been around the block. I haven't been around the block. What those root causes are. But I would encourage you to say that if your hospital administration doesn't meet with you on a regular basis, which I would define as every Tuesday at 7 in the morning or 6 in the morning, have a cup of coffee, or once a month, then you've got the wrong program or the wrong CEO, and you should go look for another job. Because honestly, in those programs, we probably are looking to you to say, hey, what's going on here? Help me fix it. Do we have the right intensivist service? Do we have enough APPs? Do we have the right nurses? You might not get the answer you want, but it might be something that is worth discussing. And then I think the only thing I'd add to your comment is that what we've seen in the NCDR registries is what's even worse, is that 2 providers who go to different hospitals have spectacular outcomes in one hospital, and they are the worst provider in the other. And then it makes it obvious that the system around you is what's crumbling, and it's not the great work that you're probably all doing.
David, do you want to comment on the number of programs and volumes out in the country? Because I think I was in on a conference call years ago when you brought that up. What percentage of programs are doing what volumes out there? Any idea recently? What percentage of I mean, I remember the answer, but I was curious to see what you've learned recently.
Specifically for cabbage valve?
Yeah, just say cardiac cabbage. Just say.
Yeah, I mean, the volumes have pretty much stabilized in cabbage, but they're, half or less what they were when we talked about this, years ago.
Right.
But I will say I see Noboru and Shinichi that it's the volumes in Japan are far, an order of magnitude lower than in the U.S., and they have managed in most programs to have reasonably good results, but in some programs, results that are not acceptable. So there is a tremendous spectrum internationally in the volume of cases. And different countries and different areas of the country have evolved different ways of dealing with the low volume issue. But clearly there is a volume outcome association in cardiothoracic surgery. It's less for cabbage because it's a fairly mature specialty. It does exist for valvular surgery, and then when you get into thoracic aortic surgery, for example, the volume outcome association becomes significantly stronger. Bottom line.
John Howington, Nashville, Tennessee. Just put the question a different way. We know in thoracic surgery that the majority of thoracic surgery is done in low volume centers and by low volume surgeons. So is that the case with cardiac surgery? It's a majority of, if you looked at all the cases done in the U.S., is it spread across? I know there are some high volume centers, but if you look at the total number of cases, are more being done in low volume centers or high volume?
I would say that it is not the case that it is mostly low volume centers. I think the majority of the cases are being done in high to medium volume programs in cardiac surgery. But it's certainly true in general thoracic because you still have a lot of general thoracic surgery, frankly, is being done by general surgeons, as you know, and a lot of it's being done by very small 1 or 2 person practices. So it's a little different scenario. I think there's more consolidation in larger centers of cardiac surgery practice.
I think I'd add that our intent in having programs is to obviously serve the patients of the community. That said, we have about 45 to 50 markets across the U.S., and we have 90 programs. So we generally feel that in each market, we need a program. In Nashville, we have 1 program. But in some cities like Richmond, Virginia, or Jacksonville, Florida, or Tampa, or others, we have what I feel could be, as volumes shift, more programs then we need to serve the patients of the community. And that's just one healthcare system. There might be 5 healthcare systems in that same community. There's a tremendous surgeon shortage. The future of cardiovascular surgery, cardiothoracic surgery is complex at best. And understanding what we'll be talking about 10 years from now in this room almost feels to me that one surgeon who's in greater demand will go to more programs, and those programs will be generally lower volume because they will continue to persist for the need to serve those patients. But that's just a forecast that I'm not so clear on.
Just a quick comment. In the last esophageal model, I think it was 2 or 3 of the 7 or 8 3-star programs were low-volume centers. So this assumption that volume means better outcomes, it's not entirely true, and it's just something that many people just assume, and they look at past data, but at least in the thoracic surgery component, that's not being found to be true. And there can be many, many reasons for that. But I do think it's, because that's been bandied around here, it's worth mentioning.
I just say, the Volume Outcome Association is an average association, so there are certainly high-performing, low-volume programs, and occasionally low-performing, high-volume programs. But on average, for complex procedures, higher volume is associated with better outcomes. I think that's pretty well established. Do you want to comment on that from an esophagectomy standpoint?
Well, I guess, Dan, the only other comment I would make, and maybe Dr. Sheehan can add some insight to this as well, is that it seems that, certain procedures have a stronger volume outcome association compared to others, probably due to the complexity, but, also maybe due to the structure that those hospitals and programs have in place to take care of those patients.
Yeah, I mean, there are many hospitals in the United States that may do 1 or 2 esophagectomies a year. I wouldn't go to that place for my esophagectomy, and nor would anybody in this room. So I think among experts, we all know that there is a volume outcome association.
And then also, sorry, go ahead.
There are few high-volume esophagectomy programs in the country relative to other operations as well, so that may be a reason that we don't see as strong an association.
And I think deeper dives on that have done 2x2 analyses that differentiate between high-volume operators in low-volume programs, versus every other permutation of that. And so it's possible that a low volume program might have the surgeon that's coming from the high volume program, and then the question is, could they maintain their good clinical outcomes or not, and then what would be those root causes?
All right, we'll take one last question and move on to our final 2 speakers. Yes, sir.
Saqib Masroor from Toledo. One stakeholder that's missing in this conversation is the patient. I'd like to know what the patient beliefs and perception is about all this issue, because we see it time and again. They don't want to drive the extra 20 miles. I was driving 50 miles to go to another hospital, but the patient I saw at one hospital, where the family would not want to drive 10 miles to another hospital. And then we always hear some stories, horror stories. They go to a big center and they're treated very impersonally. They don't know who they saw, what they did. They couldn't find the parking spot. They find it better to come to a small hospital. They know the surgeon. They have their phone number. They feel very well taken care of. And sometimes they may be willing to overlook that, yeah, granddad died of tamponade, but they don't know they died of tamponade. They know that they were taken care of, and they were be very thankful to the surgeon, everyone, for doing all they did. So I think in all this discussion, we should not ignore the voice of the customer, so to speak, and see what they want.
Well, the classic study is Finlayson's study, in which he surveyed patients and said, I think they talked about pancreatectomy as the operation that was supposedly going to be offered, and patients would often accept a 3 to 4 times higher mortality at their local community hospital rather than travel to a regional center. So there's tremendous bias on the part of patients to be able to stay close to home, no question about it. That's where I think payers and other intermediaries are probably going to have to help to shift the paradigm. So if you can make the out-of-pocket expenses lower at a high-performing regional center, that may be an incentive that will help drive the patient towards that center rather than staying close by. I don't know, Dr. Mnookin may want to comment on that from the perspective of HCA.
Well, I mean, I think there's not one decision that you all make in any component of your life that you wouldn't rather make with some kind of publicly reported data, like is this Jiffy Lube better than that Jiffy Lube? That said, I think already in place there's tremendous soft and hard steerage by payers to influence patients, and it would be and there have been examples where providers that are in the bottom quartile in national registries or others have been removed from preferred payer plans. And so, oh my gosh, just say, well, you can't have surgery in a 1-star program. I mean, that's the end of that. And then you say, well, you have to be above the 50th percentile to go there, and you've got a bronze, silver, or gold copay. Even though you bought the bronze plan, within that, your copay could be 5 to 10-fold higher. And since the patient is not always, the patient is usually not the primary payer, it goes to the payer. And since the payer is not usually the primary payer, it goes to the employer. And then it continues to go upstream to say, who is really saying, well, I don't think my employer wants me out of work because I had a cabbage gone wrong and I'm in rehab for 6 weeks. So they're going to tell me where I'm going to have this done. And they're all going to use publicly reported data to probably figure it out. But David, I don't know if that kind of is what you thought I'd say.
And there's certainly a business case to be made for higher performing centers having a low cost. So it is to the advantage of the payers, and also there's a business case to be made for steering patients to centers of excellence for a particular procedure. I know we wrote a paper at Michigan looking at centers of excellence for mitral valve repair, and the business case for steering patients even greater than 50 to 75 miles away to those centers for better outcomes and lower cost overall outcomes, higher rate of repair, lower cost throughout the patient's lifetime. For example, if they got a repair, mitral valve repair versus replacement with all the attendant risks associated with that throughout their lifetime. So I think there's a good case to be made as more and more of this information permeates outside of our world. I think people are going to pick up on the fact, the payers are going to pick up on the fact that they have a way to look at different programs and look at their costs with respect to that program. And also the media is going to pick up on this as well. Yeah, one more.
I was just going to say that I would suspect many of you are in leadership roles in your facilities and programs. I would say no matter how challenging you feel the administration is, or adversarial, or not malaligned, et cetera, there is no hospital administrator who wants a bad outcome in their hospital. And if that is the case in your program, then you need to go on the carpeted floor that leads to the CEO's office on Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday and say, what can we do to try and improve our outcomes in this particular program? And then come up with a plan that enables that. And it may not be viable solutions that can get executed on immediately, but I think that this is a team sport, and I would engage those administrators because they'll probably be out of their roles before you'll be out of yours. So they want to be working with you in a collaborative way.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to our first session speakers. And we're going to go on with our next two speakers. Thanks a lot. Our next talk is going to be Dr. Jeff Jacobs. He is going to talk about the National Database and Professional Advocacy. Jeff?
Well, good morning, everybody. First, I'd like to say that I thought that the last session and the panel discussion was absolutely fantastic. Some very thoughtful dialogue about some very timely and important topics. My task is to review the different uses that the STS National Database has in the role of advocacy, really on a national basis, and I'm going to use two examples. I'm going to talk about how we use the STS National Database at the level of the National Quality Forum, and I'll also talk about how we use the STS database at the Relative Value Unit Update Committee. And I'll briefly kind of explain what each one of those organizations are and how they relate to STS and the STS database. I only have one disclosure related to some consulting work I do. So when I started preparing this talk, the first thing I said, well, what is the role that consulting has to do with databases? What is the role that using the database to consult for national quality organizations has to do with the overall utilization of the database? And then I said, well, why do we have the database in the first place? And there's a lot of reasons. The primary reason is to measure and assess quality, provide a platform for benchmarking, and therefore improve quality. We also use our database for research. We also use the database for public reporting. But this last bullet point, we use the database to provide information and data to multiple governmental agencies, including Medicare, the FDA, CPT editorial panel, Relative Value Unit Update Committee. And in the world of professional advocacy, I think three good examples are the National Quality Forum, the CPT editorial panel, and the RUC, the Relative Value Unit Update Committee. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the National Quality Forum and give some examples related to NQF. And I really want to answer three questions here related to NQF. First of all, what is NQF? Second of all, how does NQF review measures of quality? And third, what are the STS-endorsed NQF measures? So what is the NQF? The NQF is a multiple stakeholder, not-for-profit, nonpartisan, membership-based organization that works to catalyze improvements of healthcare. That's how they define themselves. And we can go to a website and read a lot about the NQF. But primarily, they review and endorse measures. They review measures of healthcare quality and they endorse these measures. They're funded by membership dues and multiple public and private sources. They're not really a governmental agency. And the members that pay these dues represent everyone with an interest in healthcare: hospitals, healthcare systems, patients, families, insurers, employers, and specialty societies like the Society of Thoracic Surgeons. And currently, there's over 400 member organizations in the National Quality Forum. Next question, how does NQF endorse measures? How do they review measures? And there's a very structured 8-step process called the consensus development process. The first step is NQF decides they want to create measures of quality on a given topic, and they call for nominations to an NQF topic-specific committee. So they can create committees about cardiac surgery, thoracic surgery, general surgery. And once this committee is created with members representing multiple stakeholders, the next step is that NQF will call for candidate standards. So any organization and any individual can propose standards of quality for healthcare to the National Quality Forum. And when STS proposes these quality standards to the National Quality Forum, we end up creating a book with hundreds of pages of data to support a given quality measure. And it's quite an impressive process that STS goes through, collaborating with the Duke Clinical Research Institute, collaborating with STS staff, and creating this 100-page-long document to support a given measure. These documents are submitted to the National Quality Forum, and the committee then undergoes candidate consensus standard review, where they have a series of phone calls followed by a two-day in-person meeting in Washington, D.C. And what this meeting looks like is there's a panel that sits at a table in the shape of a U, about 10 people, 10 people, and 10 people, so 30 people, and then the presenters of the measures sit at the head of the table. And those people are the members of the committee, and they represent every form of healthcare one could imagine. When one presents a heart surgery measure or a thoracic surgery measure to NQF, the panel includes patients, families, family advocates, podiatrists, gynecologists, obstetricians, orthopedic surgeons, experts throughout the spectrum of healthcare. And this group will evaluate the measure through a series of qualifications for the measure that I'll go through in a minute. And after this meeting, Then there's a period of time for comment from all NQF measures and comments from the public. And then there's a phone conference that takes place after this comment call and after the 2-day meeting. Once the topic-specific committee has all the data, there's a member vote, and they would approve or reject the measure. Once that happens, then it goes to a consensus standards approval committee or a CSAC committee to approve it. Then it's appealed by the board, and finally there's a time period for appeals of the measure before it's finally formally endorsed. This process can take a year. The measures are endorsed based on importance of the measure, scientific acceptability, feasibility, usability and use, and that includes use for public reporting, comparison to related or competing measures. All these different elements are used by the committee to judge whether or not the measure will be endorsed, and the process takes about 9 to 18 months, typically about a year. With that background, I want to go through what NQF measures are from the Society of Thoracic Surgeons and why this is even important to any of us as practicing physicians. So STS has developed 34 quality measures that are endorsed by the National Quality Forum. And one can go to the STS website at this hyperlink and start to see what these measures are. They're grouped by subspecialties, so there's a group of adult cardiac surgery measures, and on each one there's going to be a hyperlink that will take you to the measure specifications and what they mean. Then there's more adult cardiac surgery measures. Then there's one adult cardiac surgical individual surgeon measure, which is the individual surgeon composite measure. Then there's a group of congenital heart surgery measures and a group of thoracic measures. And let's go through what each of these are in a little bit more detail. This is a table that shows all 34 measures. The majority are adult cardiac, some are general thoracic, some are congenital heart surgery, and they're divided across the spectrum of healthcare, structure, process, outcome, and a series of composite measures. Some of the adult cardiac surgical measures, which are structure and process, include database participation, beta blockade usage preoperatively and postoperatively, antiplatelet medicines, antilipid medicines, mammary artery utilization, and antibiotic measures. Then there's a series of risk-adjusted outcome measures, first for major complications like stroke, renal failure, prolonged intubation, re-exploration, deep sternal wound infection, and readmission after coronary bypass surgery. And then there's risk-adjusted mortality measures for all of the major cardiac surgical operations, CABG, AVR, MVR, and combinations of the above. And finally, there's the composite measures that we publicly report for CABG, AVR, MVR, and combinations of AVR, CABG, MVR, CABG, and the individual surgeon composite. There's also a series of thoracic surgical measures related to lung cancer resection and database participation. And finally, there's a series of congenital heart surgery measures related to our risk model and database participation. So with that background, STS has 34 quality measures that are endorsed by the National Quality Forum, and therefore STS is the steward for more NQF endorsed measures than any other specialty-based medical professional organization. STS has invested substantial time and energy into having our measures of quality endorsed by the National Quality Forum. So why is this important? Why do we do this? Well, first of all, NQF endorsement is the gold standard for healthcare quality measures. NQF endorsed measures are recognized by national healthcare community as being best-in-class, evidence-based, and valid. And multiple organizations use these measures in a variety of ways. For example, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services uses NQF endorsed measures for MIPS, the Merit-Based Incentive Payment System. Ultimately, NQF measures are used by multiple stakeholders to assess the quality of cardiothoracic surgical care. So creating measures that come from our database creates a scenario where our database can become the gold standard for measuring the quality of cardiothoracic surgical care in multiple domains. Now I'd like to just spend a few minutes on the CPT codes and Relative Value Unit Update Committee, and I'm just going to briefly touch on this. Everything I talk about in the next few slides is published in this STS paper about how physician work is valued. So the CPT codes are codes that are used to describe medical procedures and medical services. They're used for reimbursement, but they're also used for multiple other purposes, including pay for performance and comparison of healthcare utilization. Once a CPT code is created for a given procedure, the value of that CPT code is assigned by the Relative Value Unit Update Committee, or the RUC, which is currently chaired by a cardiac surgeon, Peter Smith. The RUC is a panel of 31 physicians that generate recommendations regarding the relative value for all physician services that Medicare beneficiaries receive. And the RUC works just like the NQF. It's a multi-stakeholder panel. There's about 30 people on each side of the table and across the bar, and they sit around and they talk about these measures and they assign value to them. So the RUC will take any surgical service or any physician-provided service and develop relative value recommendations for the value of that procedure. And these relative value units have three components. Most of it is based on physician work, some on practice expense, and a small component to cover malpractice. The work RVU, which is the largest part, is calculated by multiplying the time it takes to perform a service by the intensity of the service. That's the formula used to calculate work. And where the STS database comes in is that the STS database provides data to support these calculations. So data from the STS database is used at the RUC to measure the value of cardiac surgery at a national level. What I've tried to do is briefly go through these three organizations and show where data from our database informs the deliberations of these three groups. In the final analysis, data from the STS database is used to measure both the quality of cardiac surgery at NQF and the value of cardiothoracic surgery at a national level at CPT and RUC. We speak with authority at these national organizations because the STS National Database represents over 95% of adult and pediatric cardiac surgery in the United States, and our representativeness allows us to sit at these organizations, speak with authority, and help them use our data to measure value and quality in cardiothoracic surgery. I think this slide I use in a lot of my database talks kind of sums up why this has value. Science tells us what we can do, guidelines tell us what we should do, and registries tell us what we're actually doing. Or another way to look at it, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And by having these national quality organizations and these relative value unit update committee type organizations use STS data, we can provide the most precise and accurate data for the assessment of cardiothoracic surgical value and quality. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. That was an excellent overview. Any questions for Dr. Jacobs? Yes, sir. Now this is a plant.
This is not a plant.
I don't know because I don't know what he's going to say.
Now, there's a terrifying article, which many of you have seen in the latest New England Journal of Medicine, talking about reimbursement and the globals for cardiac surgery. If you haven't seen it, you got to read it. There's about an 18% projected decrease for reimbursement for cardiac surgery, and I think for thoracic it's 16%, very close. And the problem is that we have not, in some cases we, as surgeons, have not been doing what we say we have done post-operatively, but in other cases it's a question of documentation. How can the STS database provide better data for this very important part of the work we do?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. The portion of our payment that we receive from Medicare, and therefore from most other insurance companies, that is supposed to cover our post-operative management of patients for the first 90 days is at jeopardy. There's no doubt about that. And I think a large portion of that is related to documentation, because most cardiothoracic surgeons do take care of their patients after surgery, but the documentation that allows proof that that's really happening is lacking. And those variables right now are not variables that we capture in the STS database. So that's a discussion that really has to be happened. Is this a piece that we should try to start capturing in the STS database at a time when many of our overall goals is to reduce data entry burden? So these are kind of conflicting objectives, to reduce data entry burden, but to capture more data about post-operative visits. There probably is a good reason to start doing that to prove that we're really doing this work, but there's certainly some data entry burden that's associated with that. It's a tricky question.
I'll just follow up on Jeff's comments. Certainly a provocative statement with respect at least to the database and the data we should collect. A lot of effort has taken place this year to reduce the data we're collecting, but there's, if we're not measuring our post-operative care, we're not capturing the spectrum of care we deliver, the quality of care we deliver, and it's something we'll have to consider. And perhaps with our new technology and more automation, there may exist opportunities to do this in the future. So I think it's certainly something to explore.
And also, obviously, our participation in the postoperative care obviously impacts the outcomes. So I think that absolutely we need to figure a way to get this better described. And I know our last speaker, who's not here, Alan Spear, has been trying to lead the charge for this and improve the lack of documentation of the postoperative care of our patients.
Yeah,
That was a great point. Great
We've been
question.
able to use data from the STS database to document how long it takes to do a CABG, how long it takes to do a lobectomy, door-to-door time, and incision to closure time. We've been able to use that data to document intensity of the work related to the preoperative risk factors associated with patient populations. We right now can't really use it to document postoperative care to the detail we would need to fight this argument, but it may be something that we should be doing because those data, I think, are going to be very useful. And you're right, it's the right thing to do. You take care of your patients, they do better.
It's part of the operation as far as,
Of course.
I'm concerned. Okay, our final speaker, Mark Kopson. Mark is a healthcare attorney from the firm Plunkett Cooney, and he's got a lot of experience in contracting and contract negotiations with providers and payers, and he's going to talk about using data and the STS database in quality, value-based contracting and reimbursement. Mark?
Good morning. As the only non-physician on the panel, I'm bringing up the rear, but I prefer to think of it as playing batting cleanup. What I really wanted to talk about is how the data in the database is utilized in value-based contracting. And the reason it's important is because we're in a period of very rapid transition in reimbursement and compensation to a quality and value-based system away from a purely volume-based system. Now, the measures that are in place, the current contracting that's in place, typically includes some volume-based component, in many cases a large volume-based component, such as fee-for-service. And that's going to continue for the near future, but the quality value-based component is growing. And when I say quality value-based reimbursement, it can range anything from pay for performance, which has been around for many, many years, to bundled payments, much more common shared savings programs, all the way up to full capitation. This transition started in the late 80s and early 90s with primary care physicians who now in many cases have well over 25% of their total income based on or tied to the value in outcomes achievements. In 2015, 15% of the payments in healthcare were tied to value. 2 years later, that 15% had climbed to 34%, and that was 3 years ago. So the train has left the station. What does it take to implement and operate a value-based contract? It requires significant clinical, financial, data analysis, and care management expertise. And the bottom line is that it's very heavily dependent on accurate and timely data capture. Successful operation of a value-based arrangement requires expensive health information technology and comprehensive data analytics. Very high cost, and the high cost of these tools is one of the primary drivers of consolidation in both the payer and provider communities. Implementation and operation continued. The bottom line is payers have access to claims data. They always have. But that claims data alone does not tell the true quality story. The robust data analytics that are required for successful managed care requires provider-generated clinical data. There's been some talk today about clinical data that's missing. A lot of that outcomes impact on the post-care outcome impact by social determinants of health and the post-acute phase. More data needs there. Bottom line is that STS member data is significantly more complex than, for example, primary care physician data, where you're talking about things like hemoglobin A1C levels and mammogram rates and vaccines. The other factor is that the STS member data is more nuanced in terms of things like risk adjustment. Medicare Part B, the MIPS program, has been mentioned today. I take it you're familiar with it. It measures physician-reported data to 4 areas: quality, improvement activities, promoting interoperability, and cost. It's both a penalty and a bonus-based system, a carrot and a stick. You have to score a minimum of 45 points to receive a 9% uplift in fee schedule payments, and greater than 85 points to receive a bonus, which is topping out at about 6.25% these days. In 2019, what this meant for providers was that 71% of providers received both a fee uptick plus a bonus. 22% received the fee schedule uplift only. 2% received no impact whatsoever, and 5% actually realized a payment reduction. So why does this matter? Why does a Medicare program matter for you and your daily lives? Well, the reason is that whatever Medicare does, the commercial payers copy it, morph it into something that they can utilize more to their advantage. Perfect example of this is the never events. When Medicare first developed the never events concept, there were 7 or 8 measures, such as surgery on the wrong body part, where CMS said if a never event occurs, the additional cost of that hospitalization that was caused by that never event, we won't pay that additional cost. About 2 to 3 years later, virtually all the commercial payers had developed their own never event programs, which in some cases exceeded 20 different types of never events, and a couple of them even took the position that not only would they not cover the additional expense caused by the never event, they wouldn't cover the hospitalization at all. So what Medicare does have a significant impact. The bottom line is that virtually all payers and candidly the majority of health systems now have some VBR component in their reimbursement and compensation. As Dr. Manoukian mentioned earlier, they're very definitely looking at the data and tying, as his quote was 20, 40, up to 60% of compensation tied to quality and value. Both the percentage of the payers utilizing value-based reimbursement and the relative component size of value to volume, both of those percentages are increasing. One of the reasons was mentioned also earlier was that the large employers are demanding it. The large employers, in large part, the healthcare costs directly impact their bottom line through self-insurance mechanisms, and so we're going to see that continue. I serve on the board of directors of the American Health Lawyers Association, and I speak with general counsel for health plans, health systems, large provider groups across the country, and they uniformly report and confirm that, in fact, the value-based reimbursement is increasing. So when you're going to talk about entering into a potential value-based contract, the threshold question you have to ask yourself is, how much can we afford to lose if our performance falls short of the targets or floors that are established to measure the value? In that regard, the measures or the targets actually drive the risk-reward analysis. Because of that, it's crucially important that surgeons have a say in what those targets or measures are and how they're going to be measured. That's where the STS database comes in. Because it all comes down to data. To appropriately evaluate data, you must define the specific and measures by which it will be measured, and then you have to accurately and timely capture and analyze the data to do so. So I ask you, who is more capable or better prepared to do that for thoracic surgeons than the STS? The quality collaborative that Dr. Prager talked about earlier today I just wanted to touch on a couple of points of the reimbursement. That program is subsidized, 80% of the cost of that program is subsidized by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan as part of their value partnership arrangement. For surgeons, participation in the PGIP program, which started out with primary care, results in 110% of the regular fee schedule. And then the value-based component means that if you satisfy, you meet the criteria, the value components, you're eligible for a 3% uplift. Now, I've spoken with Tom Lydon, who is the Blue Cross Blue Shield of Michigan Value Programs Director, and he was very adamant about the fact that 3% isn't going to make a difference with surgeons. It's thoracic surgeons. It's not what motivates them. And I agree. It was said earlier today, what motivates is self-determination, the ability to do challenging work, and to improve quality and receive good results. And that's what happens when you have these types of programs that focus on the data that the STS collects and generates. There were 90 surgeons participating in that collaborative. 84 of them were eligible in 2019 by virtue of having 1 year of participation in PGIP and reporting 2 years of data. And of those 84 eligible, all of them received the maximum possible points. So to the hospitals, 33 hospitals, out of 100 points possible, 3 were at that, but 19 of them were in the 80 to 100, and 11 were in the 90 to 100 point category. So the bottom line is that the STS database is exceptionally useful as a basis for value-based contracts for thoracic surgeons. The measures and the data, as we've heard repeatedly today, are those that truly matter to you and your patients, and it allows you to objectively demonstrate the increased value you bring to your hospitals, your health systems, and your health plans. So because of that, I applaud the STS for utilizing the registry, for putting all the time, money, and effort into it, and for the improvements we've heard about today. And I think it holds a lot of potential to help thoracic surgeons in the coming years as you fight for that ever diminishing compensation slice. Thank you.
Any questions? Any questions for Mark or Jeff before we conclude the program? Mark, have you seen use of actual STS data outcomes, surgeon-specific, for example, in individual contract negotiations?
Absolutely. One of the points that I referred to in one of the slides was the fact that the majority of health systems today are utilizing STS data and the surgeons' outcomes and scores to, number one, make the initial hiring decision whether they're going to offer a position to the surgeon or not, and then two, very, very quickly develops into a significant component of compensation as the systems themselves are receiving a greater and greater portion of their revenue based on outcomes. Pure volume measures like RVUs don't capture the full picture, and because of that, they're looking to the results data.
I was just going to ask Jeff to elaborate because I think it's important on the value of NQF endorsement of our performance measures on increasing confidence in our voluntary public reporting program.
Well, the NQF measures are certainly viewed as the gold standard of all quality measures. The multi-stakeholder endorsement process is extremely rigorous, looking at statistical validity, face validity, looking at if a measure is suitable for public reporting, looking at if it has a competing measure. And I think what that does is it allows us to say with confidence that the measures that were publicly reported are the best in class and are suitable for public reporting. Every single measure that we publicly report today in thoracic and congenital and in adult cardiac has gone through the NQF endorsement process. And it just allows us to say we're publicly reporting the right information.
Go ahead, Mark.
Frank, if I could just comment on something from the earlier panel today when they were talking about gaming the system and underreporting data, et cetera. There's a distinct difference between the clinical data that the database captures and claims data. But what you have to remember is that the payers have both sets of data. And that is what is going to ultimately drive their reimbursement, their negotiated compensation arrangements with physicians and health systems, including thoracic surgeons. So while you can fool some of the people some of the time, you can't fool all the people all the time, and the truth will out when money is involved.
Yeah, and Medicare, CMS takes their quality measures and has them NQF endorsed as well. So there's a series of coronary bypass quality measures from the STS database, and there's another set from Medicare data using administrative data.
Okay. I want to thank all our speakers today, and I want to thank everybody else for coming and participating in this year's Practice Management Database session. Thank you very much. Have a nice day.
You're doing a great job. Very impressive.
I know.
You ran a good meeting yesterday. A great